Is this an argument that you've sort of come across yet, that the sort of AI, agentic AI as a SaaS killer? Good day, everybody, and welcome to Undocked. I'm Raal Harris.
I'm Nick Chubb. Good to see you, Raal.
Good to see you, Nick, as always. You're in a different location today, the people may observe.
I am. I'm in London today, so I'm in a WeWork, and I'm in one of those soundproof booths that is not soundproof, it turns out, and also hotter than the sun.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah,
a little bit sweaty.
We might really find you speed through this episode.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up. Come on, let's go.
Yeah. That's all for this week. Well, people might also notice I've had some shutters fitted. So there you go.
Nice.
Utterly fabulous if anyone's interested. And they're really good. They're making a big difference.
They're going to be our first sponsor.
Yeah, they could be. I should have asked for a discount, shouldn't I? But yeah, because before I had to shut the curtains because the sunlight sort of streams in through there. But the shutters, I've been able to angle it, which has given me a lovely glow.
It's beautiful. Hey, you look great.
Thank you. Good,
Shows
good.
off the beard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So people are noticing I am kicking back for the summer and growing a beard. I didn't want to. Why should you have all the beard? But anyway, Nick, no doubt a busy week after last week.
Indeed.
Congratulations once again on Digital Ship. Prompted me to read it again this week and saw some good stories there. But what caught your eye this week?
There is some breaking news, which I've literally just been notified of, that we are publishing about this morning. And that is DNV is spinning out its software arm. DNV has run a set of software called Ship Manager, which is like a technical fleet management ERP. They've had it for many, many years. They're spinning it out to be an independent business called CFARER. And that is the letter C followed by the word fairer. So I'll get your first impressions on the brand, as you're a bit of a branding expert.
Well, I don't like to offend anyone, but I think any names that require a sort of explanation or kind of, I tend to avoid that. Intrigue is not what you're looking for. Always.
One of my biggest regrets in the brand Theseus is that no one knows how to say it. So if you're on the phone, people say, is that DCS? Or you have to spell it out, or people say, is it Theseus or Thetius? Or so it's become a bit of a running joke internally. I do agree, if you have to spell out a name, it's a tricky one. But the thinking behind the name is quite nice. That they've said the name Seafarer is a commitment to the people who keep ships moving offshore and onshore, the seafarers. So this is going to be an independent business unit. DNV is going to be a majority owner. And Wilhelmsen Port Services are buying in as a minority stakeholder. And Wilhelmsen Port Services has a small software team in-house that's going to join into the kind of Seafarer team. And it's a really interesting move. I knew something was going on at DNV Ship Manager. I know they've been sort of looking at potentially selling it, those sorts of options over the last few years. But this is quite interesting to sort of give it its own management and its own identity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, generally, looking at classification societies and how they diversify. Obviously, DNV technology is not new to DNV. We've seen acquisition I was part of, obviously with Lloyd's, ABS, kind of making moves I've seen on a few fronts as well. So this is kind of like an interesting discussion that most of the class societies, I think, see that having some kind of footprint in maritime software as a service, which we're going to talk about this morning. But I think, and like you, I was aware that there were potentially deals afoot in the market. So I think what's also really interesting there is Wilhelmsen as well, because Wilhelmsen, different ship managers have, I would say, different kind of teams in terms of commitment to in-house software development teams. BSM, obviously, big example of someone, a huge number of developers with a monetized stream in MariApps versus people that have perhaps more of an in-house IT team, but are not so focused on software development, that sort of thing. But Wilhelmsen, I would say, is somebody who kind of look to perhaps more self-sufficiency in certainly in my experience in terms of software. So it's interesting to see that partnership happening there as well. And another scoop, it must be, you know what it is? It's because we record this on a Wednesday. And I know this from my marketing communications style. It's like there are peak times to announce deals. Tuesday, Wednesday is typically, good because people aren't bedded into their emails on Monday morning and they're not packing up for the weekend. So I think that's the joy that we get, that
Scoop
kind of
Wednesdays.
little sweet spot. We should stick to Wednesdays. But no, I think that is a really, really interesting move as well. I think it's kind of the thing that I find with the CFARER thing. I understand, but is it ungracious of me to sort of say that I was kind of perhaps one of the first people looking at that, positioning things around people, particularly around the technology side of things. Everybody's kind of moved into that direction for understandable reasons. But I also think ship management software is not, for me, is not really about sort of, so much about, it's a very technical space. And I think it's probably more to do with them. They mentioned the short professional, but for me, that's really who gets the benefit from this sort of software. There are some gains to those on board in terms of being able to save a little bit of time on the workflows, but it's really transformative, much more at the fleet level for me personally. So from a branding perspective, I do find that one, but I've got friends there. I don't want to upset anyone, so I'll shut up. Interesting discussion to be had, because I want to zoom in very much on this, thinking about how relationships with vendors and software and how we kind of tie that together. And last week we got into this idea of sort of collaborative autonomy and the idea of discussion around what we might, what that world might look like in terms of the logistics and supply chain, because yes, you can link up different vessels and understand, where they are from a navigational point of view. There's obviously safety benefits we talked about there, but then hooking into ports is where the real value kind of happens, because you're sort of having to coordinate multiple vessels, berths, etc. But then I think we touched on as well, well, then if you've got smart cities and all of that, and then you're linking through to smart ports and collaborative autonomy there is that supply chain kind of thing. So that's what caught my eye in an article in Splash, which is entitled Shipping and the Era of Integrated Configurable Solutions. And a shout out to Wolfgang Lehrmacher and Hans Galland, who supplied this article to Splash. And this, really, when you get into the bones of the article, what they're kind of questioning is in integrating and putting all those different pieces together, that AI is the real game changer. We talked about that as a way of kind of like almost like a middleware data processor, and it positions it between two kind of unsatisfactory solutions. I think I'm not misquoting them. On the one hand, generic software, which doesn't understand how your whole supply chain works, and it's only a piece of the puzzle, therefore describing that as sort of unsatisfactory. And then on the other hand, complete customized bespoke solutions, which then you're in your own little world.
Yeah.
And there are other issues associated with that. So AI being this configurable component which allows you to pull all those different elements together and sort of act as as something that almost supersedes those kind of relationships that you might have with vendors. And typically what I found interesting about it was when it was talking about linking across different sort of parts of your operations, and the way in which that then means the vendor is almost kind of like, you've got software people who essentially have to then become business consultants, and business consultants who are then obliged to also have some sort of software kind of component, because the whole thing needs to become much more consultative and much more configured to the client's specific needs and specifics of their kind of operations, which are often deceptively similar looking, but once you get under the hood, have some very different applications. And so the reason that I found this really interesting is because I've been playing with a couple of ideas, and I've nearly raised them on here a couple of times, around this sort of like stealth change that goes along with agentic AI.
Yeah.
Now, we'll dig into this because this is really the kind of main thrust of what I wanted to talk about today. But I do want to pause for 1 second, because it also occurs to me that a lot of people watching this podcast might be going like, here we go again, another episode, and they're talking about AI again. Okay. I think that would be an understandable reaction. I think the reason that we always come back to AI is because it is the main thing that is happening in technology. And there is very little happening outside of it, because it's sprawling, it's going into so many things. So I want to just give our listeners some statistics. This week, there were the quarter filings for the big technology companies. Okay. Big tech has spent this year 155 billion. This is just the top four. 155 billion on AI this year. And that means they've spent more than the US government has on education, jobs, and social services in 2025 this year. Okay. And over the past 2 weeks, we've had Meta, we've had Microsoft, we've had Amazon and Alphabet, which is obviously Google's parent. They've all shared their quarterly financial reports. And the reason it's sort of showing up is because of CapEx. And it might seem a little bit strange that it's showing up in their capital expenditure, but this is a good proxy for their technology spend as far as AI is concerned. And it requires kind of obviously big infrastructure, lots of power, water even, semiconductor chips, all that sort of stuff. And that's why it's kind of showing up, this spend, in what they're doing. Now, interestingly, I always say follow the money is a really good indicator. So that's the money being spent there. But the stock price on the announcement that they've spent all this money, and by the way, they want to spend a whole lot more money on this, was extremely well received in the market. So I just grabbed a couple of statistics here. Meta's market cap shot up by more than 130 billion, and Microsoft's valuation soared past 4 trillion. So when we go into why are these guys talking about AI again, it's the only game in town.
I think it would be a bit like at the kind of turn of the 20th century, people saying, "Oh, these guys just keep talking about electricity." And I genuinely think it's that kind of shift. So keep talking about it. I've got no issue with that.
Just a couple of things just to kind of make that point as well. Like, okay, is it the latest thing? Is it the big thing at the moment? And then things will move on, right? So this is a prediction in the Wall Street Journal. In total, the 4 tech companies will spend more than 400 billion on CapEx in the coming year. That's from the Wall Street Journal. So we've said 155 so far this year, and already predicted at 400 billion next year. So now, why is this the case? I won't try and cover all of the different dimensions to it here. And I'll just instead try and kind of encapsulate in a single thing. We talked about the super worker, I think it was 2 episodes ago. And I posited in there that, if you were to ignore it and come back in a couple of years' time, work would be so transformed, you wouldn't recognize the workplace that you were in. There is an argument, and hopefully we can talk about it today and share our perspectives. And I think it will kind of maybe rattle a few cages as well. But the argument that's going on is whether or not this will not only change and disrupt the software market, but it could potentially be a killer for the whole software as a service, the SaaS model. And this is something that I picked up a few weeks ago, just listening and doing some various pieces of research. And there are counter arguments as well, and we'll get into those. But if you think about why SaaS exists and what that paradigm shift to software as a service, and now what's happening with agentic AI, you can see why people might think the disruption might not just about, software applications are going to change, but the whole paradigm could change. So I'd really like to get into that this morning. But my first question to you is this an argument that you've come across yet? Agentic AI as a SaaS killer?
I've seen it kind of doing the rounds on social media and in various places I kind of read. But what I'm not 100% sure on, and I guess I'll kick it straight back to you to ask, replaced by what? Like, what is the new business model? What does agentic AI actually enable that pulls you away from it being delivered through a SaaS?
The biggest kind of example of it, which is simple, is the user interface. Okay, so when you're accessing lots of pre-canned processes and you're kind of looking for data visualization because you're the one that's got to work with the application to find what you're looking for, the UI is extremely important. The UI is your route to all your information, and the user experience, you could argue as well, is also all bound up in that. And that's normally the biggest differentiator. The UI, the UX, the usability of it, along with the speed and performance and security, these are all important as well. But you would hope that those sorts of things were sort of table stakes, and it's really about how well the application is designed, the domain knowledge of the software vendor and everything that's working with it. That's what's going to give you the real differentiation in the market, and will to a certain extent determine your stickiness, I guess, and your pricing power potentially. So if you then accept that language is going to be the way that you interface with it, and instead of kind of you needing to be able to work the application to find the things that you need and to unearth the information, the insight you need, that you are instead using an agent, which you just simply task with the various things that you want to see, there is an argument which says, why do you need a UI anymore, or at least isn't it much less important? Isn't it much more stripped down? So I think that's a big part of the argument. The second thing is that the way in which the software application or software as a service is described in this debate as a I think what's the acronym? We love an acronym, don't we, on here, Nick? CRUD. You've come across CRUD before?
These are the operations of data storage, right? So it's create, read, update, and delete.
Yeah. So they're basically saying, look, all of the applications that you use, all the fancy things that you do, fundamentally, this is what they're doing. That's what you're engaging and that's what you're doing through the UI. And some of what I've read is also unearthing a little bit of dissatisfaction, I think, with the software as a service model. So it's kind of there's a little bit like you do get the sense that some people have been like desperately keen and waiting for the moment where they can kind of jump on this and so. But when you look at it from that simplification sort of point of view, if that's what those applications are doing, that's fundamentally what an agent is going to be doing for you as well. That you can ask the agent to do any of that, and if they can get to the database, then obviously they're able to just work directly on that, and that sort of interface or graphical interface, layer that we've all come to understand as being the main thing about computing starts to kind of disappear. And then, we're talking about typing. Well, you can just as easily use voice activation for this. So that kind of changes the whole sort of thing even more. But I think one of the things that is implicit in the AI and software kind of story is that the idea of SaaS is that you are relying on or delegating to these people as a service that they know this domain better maybe than you do, or certainly that they have deep domain understanding of what is the optimum process for you in what you're trying to do. And if you've got other things you want, tell us not how we should do it and how we should build the software. No, you tell us what's the problem you're trying to achieve. And then we put on these great UX minds and they will kind of come up with the best solution for you. And by the way, for the whole market, because we want to sell it to the whole market. And what this is doing is challenging that and saying, well, actually, once you get into the AI era, the systems need to be very specific to my needs, personal needs. And they need to be able to learn about my processes and adjust and deal with all my exceptions. And so I want to be able to write those prompts, to ask those questions, to work directly with it. And these are I think this is what's philosophically different about the approach. Does that make sense?
It does. I think there's also a commercial difference, right? So just in terms of like the world's reaction to SaaS generally, I guess plot a little bit of a history lesson. It was Mark Benioff of Salesforce who first kind of came out and said he was parading around San Francisco with a placard on himself talking about the death of software, because software used to be delivered on disks. You would pay for it once as a license. It would be delivered on disks and then you'd install it. And Mark Benioff and Salesforce were some of the first people to say, we're going to move software to the cloud. And what they would say was we're effectively killing software. And instead of paying an enormous amount for your license, we're going to charge you a very reasonable monthly or annual fee to basically rent the software from us. And that's kind of where the SaaS industry came from. At the kind of fringes of the software world, way outside of Maritime, there is a bit of a kind of counterculture to that now. And so Jason Fried and David Hannemeyer-Hansen, the two guys who run 37 Signals, they are a indie software house, I guess the best way to describe them. So they created tools like Basecamp and Hey, the email client. Really cool company. David Hannemeyer-Hansen created Ruby on Rails. And they have, in the last 2 years or so, started releasing software under a program they call Once, which is it's cloud-based software that you pay for once, and then you effectively download and configure to your own cloud, because we all now have access to AWS and things like that. So you don't need someone else's cloud software to be on their cloud. You can basically run it on your own cloud. So they've come out and said, this is stupid. We're all paying stupid amounts of money every month for all these software licenses. Every business is doing this. We should go back to the old model of paying for software once. And I think there's a combination of that, plus you've got agentic AI coming along where you can fire up Replit, sign up for a Replit account, and you can build an application. You can literally get an application going live in the real world that does something useful in 10, 15 minutes of prompting Replit. So anyone can build software. And I think where agentic AI is going to take us is that we go from these kind of potentially quite high monthly subscription costs to paying for the compute power of the agent or compute power of the model that we're using to either build the software or to perform some kind of function. And so you end up going to something closer to a pay per use plus the license you pay for once. And the whole, at that point, so easy to configure your own cloud environment to run this sort of stuff. At that point, you end up in a situation where the SaaS business model starts to collapse because no one's going to want to pay high monthly or annual fees for a software that does something that you can replicate yourselves very, very easily and very, very cheaply.
There is a counter argument, and we'll definitely get into that and challenge some of those points there. But this is also interesting because clearly this has big implications for vendors who work on that model. The one that I remember, the big SaaS one that I remember, the change was I was running a multimedia department at Videotel, and we were very dependent on the Adobe suite. And then suddenly they were like, well, now you've got to move to Creative Cloud, which was actually more expensive for us at the time on the model that they did and everything, and that was the one that I remember changed. So people like Adobe, Microsoft as well. And it's actually their CEO, I should know his name, shouldn't I?
Satya
Nadella, that's him. Watching him talking about this, and he's actually talking about not only just the SaaS model, but talking about applications themselves, the disappearance of applications themselves, or certainly the way in which we expect to work with them. Because you've got this ability, you're working directly. And he talked to some good stuff online about him talking about how he sees kind of Copilot and how that will kind of work with applications and all that sort of stuff. And the model, I think you kind of alluded to how you see the model working with agents and stuff like that. That's a bit I haven't sort of got my head around, because you could easily see a route where that ended up being, the agent as a service or whatever. But and there were some really kind of really interesting ideas around this. So one of the other things that came up looking at this was the way in which software will need to evolve to remain sort of competitive in part of this world, and came across a nice thing that it's not just about sort of APIs were such a big game changer in software when 10 or 12 years ago it became like a must big part of the discussion, and now talking about ACIs, the agent computer interface. Okay, so this is basically like within your application you need to be thinking around, well, how are the agents going to want to access this application, and how am I going to make it available and make it possible for somebody to extend my offering with their agents that they're perhaps under their control and that they're working with, to be able to come in and do that. And see, that seems to me to be a very sort of sensible kind of compromise, to look at this in that way. And those of us that work in marketing will have seen, huge drop off in the number of queries and stuff when suddenly the model changed. So it was looking for an AI, agent focused world. So if you present your copy as answers to questions that you can predict the agent to ask, then suddenly you're the one that's kind of coming up first. And that was a big shock, I think, for everybody in the marketing world earlier this year. So I think that seems to me to be a sort of a very sensible kind of thing. And so let's get into some of the counter arguments as well. I started talking about what software developers will need to do. But I think that I think the other thing that you're saying there is let's challenge that idea that the only thing that the SaaS company does is provide the CRUD for you to be able to kind of access your information, because what they also provide is a lot of very hard-coded business processes in there that actually are giving you that continuity, giving you that governance, giving you that kind of that consistency that perhaps you're not going to get from an agent. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about like you don't always get consistent results with the same prompts or with the same GPTs. Kind of, they can hallucinate a little bit and with some nice, interesting kind of creative results. But if you're in the compliance business, you don't want creativity. You don't want kind of ambiguity. You want just consistency. You want to know that that governance is there. So I think that there's plenty of reasons why I think people would continue to want to work with that SaaS model.
I've seen people be kind of almost a bit snobby about new companies entering the space that are effectively a wrapper on top of an LLM. So like people would say, oh, that's just a ChatGPT wrapper, or that's just a Claude wrapper or whatever. Effectively, what they're saying is you could just go to ChatGPT or you could just go to Claude. But I think that negates how much value comes from two things. One is good UI UX and the ability to get that into users' hands and for users to feel comfortable using that. And then two is actually brand and what gets wrapped up in what you can achieve by having a good, consistent brand in a space for a long time that people begin to trust. I don't see a world where anyone in the maritime industry is going to turn around and say, I want to start delegating all of our operational decision making to ChatGPT. But I think if you take some of those large software houses that exist in the industry and have done for many, many years, and they say we are bringing these features into the SaaS and we're doing it in a way that we know that you can rely on, I think that's going to win over effectively just the sort of going direct to where the end model is. And I think people getting upset about a wrapper on ChatGPT or whatever, going back to my earlier analogy, it's a bit like people getting upset at the invention of the light bulb because it uses electricity. Like I don't see that this new technology is not an endpoint, it's an infrastructure that you can build on top of. It's not a product in its own right.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about with the cynicism there, and I think some of that is that there was such a wow factor in the beginning with what you could do with ChatGPT that then someone coming along saying we've cracked AI in maritime, and all it is sort of something on top of ChatGPT. I think maybe that was kind of a little bit of that they didn't sort of really believe the pitch. But in terms of using tools and using, that's just like nonsense, Like the idea that we're going to get this movement of people who want artisan software, I want to know that all the code was done by hand. I don't want them using any frameworks. I'm like all these hipsters in sort of coffee house. Like I only use handcrafted apps. I mean, it's a nice idea, isn't it? But I mean, it's absolute nonsense. Like of course, as any good software house will use, and any good developer, by the way, will use things that accelerate their ability to kind of get things done, and frameworks that kind of take care of a lot of the more perfunctory kind of stuff, and I always used to get really frustrated with developers that wanted to do everything themselves, and of course they always had a good reason why they must do it. What it was really like, they really liked creating stuff themselves and they didn't really like having to work with other people's stuff. I think the thing that's interesting as well is that I don't think that the two counters to this, like it's just a wrapper on top. One, and this is where people can start to really think about their IP, is what are you training it on? In maritime, we have very, very specific, operational things, very specific things from a kind of a safety point of view, from a compliance point of view. It's fraught with danger if you're going to look out to the wider world and say, please create for me on the basis of all that information that's out there, because the likelihood of it being inaccurate you're just pushing the problem elsewhere, because it just means what you create then has to go through a team of experts who are going to analyze it and check that it's correct. It's far more sensible to train it with experts on expert material, on verified material. So I think there's IP in that. If you have access to content, whether that's kind of a library of video or images, if you're looking at it from that sort of image processing world, or if it's documentation, or if it's just raw data about voyage performance, all that kind. There is IP in all of that, because you will have a superior product. I think the second thing is the implication that you've just put this layer on top. And I think that, just to come back to one of the quotes that's in the article that I thought was interesting here, and it was, productivity gains come more from process transformation than new technology. And I think that's one of the things that's also implicit in this agentic world, right? The system needs to be able to learn to adapt to the specifics of what you're doing, to be able to give you the right answer. And that's where I think it's challenging for those that are going to just put an agent into a generic SaaS product. Because you're not going to get, it's going to be harder to give them the answer that they want, because you don't understand the context. And that's the really crucial thing about the agent and training the agent, for them to understand, and what I loved was when someone talked about like the value of an agentic approach, to be able to do the exception handling. Because I can't tell you, in my career of working on solutions for ship owners and operators, managers, the number of times you think you've got the rule and you go, it's like this, it's A plus a plus, and they go, yes, but, or yes, except when
Yeah.
this is the case. And then
Yeah.
it's like, so then the logic unravels and you're back and you're there with all your stickies trying to plot out, well, how do we
Yeah.
deal with that exception from a code point of view? And this is the thing about an agent. It's a fundamentally different thing. It's like, if it gets to the limits of what you can do, it can even write you the code that you need to be able to overcome those limitations. So I think coming back to like, what do software developers do? We talked about the agent interface, but also thinking about, you know, how they're going to sort of facilitate that sort of world where the agent can be augmenting their product and working with their product. I think it speaks to that fundamental need that most customers will have in Maritime of wanting things to work in the way that they work.
I think that the kind of higher level advice I would give on this, if anyone asked, would be to really understand what business you're in. And I'll tell you a short story that demonstrates this. So when Michael Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg, who's a bit of like a personal hero of mine, in the 80s, when he first started the company, they had to physically build the Bloomberg terminals. So the computers didn't exist to have a terminal. So generally a company would buy one terminal and they would literally physically build it. They would get a box, they would put all the right chips in, they'd put the monitor in, they'd get a keyboard, pull it all together. And they made quite a lot of money building these machines. And then PCs started to get better and better and better. And towards the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, it got to the point where PCs were good enough that you could run the Bloomberg software on a normal PC. And there was massive resistance inside Bloomberg to stop making the machines, because the machines, physically making the machines and having a factory and all of that sort of stuff, the number of people they employed doing that was a really big money earner, and they were geared up to manufacture these machines. And the key insight that Michael Bloomberg came out with was, we are not in the computer business, we are in the information business. And whatever the best way to deliver information to our customers is, we will use that. And so overnight, they killed this hardware manufacturing arm and moved everything over to PCs. And you see that today. Bloomberg has always been one step ahead. They were one step ahead with the move to the cloud. They were one step ahead to the move with online information. You can now access a Bloomberg terminal on any device, including a mobile phone, because they understand the fundamental insight is they understand they are not in the software business. They're not in the computer business. They're not in the hardware business. They're in the information business. And I think if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I'm a software company, you might be in trouble in a few years' time if the software industry does start to take a turn because of this stuff. If you think about the actual end solution you're providing to your customers and think about the best way to deliver that, you will naturally gravitate towards more efficient, more effective ways. And that could be agentic AI. It could be something totally different. Who knows? But you really need to understand the fundamentals of what business you're in if you want to be in the game for a long time.
Well, that's what I love about our discussions, Nick, because you've actually brought me to the final point that I wanted to make on this. And that is that the software as a service bit becomes a lot simpler if you think about the service bit.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it.
Provider, right?
Yeah.
Because the service is really what the customer wants, right? The customer wants you to take care of a headache for them. That's the foundation of, you know, all SaaS businesses. What's the problem? How am I going to provide a solution for it? And how do I find that and deliver that solution at a price point that the customer sees as net positive, a worthwhile value proposition? Whereas if you kind of then say, like, you know, let's take travel, for example, do they want a piece of software that can manage all crew travel for them? Or do they actually want to just be able to say, I need to get somebody from A to B, get it to me at the cheapest possible price? You know? And it becomes about like actually delivering the service, the thing to it, and the software becomes sort of less important. You talked last week about Tesla's approach to self-driving cars versus Waygo's, wasn't it? Yeah. Which was like, let me make this as much like a human as possible. And this is the thing about an agent. And if you look at the way that people really want to use agents, or the way that's kind of opening up, it's very much like a really good assistant, right? I need to, you know, put together a schedule that allows me to see these and these people. I want to send a message to my top 5 customers, and the agent will go off and process the data to find who are the top 5 customers at the moment, where are their contact details, what are they like, what's the history of the account, so I can personalize the email, all that kind of stuff. All of that can be done by a person. All of these things can be done by an intelligent person with access to the information. And the more that becomes like a human, then it becomes much more like that service aspect of it, where you're actually kind of training a potentially unlimited workforce that you can supply services in. And that, I think, as well allows you to bring in your domain expertise, which is, really the kind of USP of a lot of these good SaaS providers, as well as the breadth of access that they have, due to the size and the girth of their operations. And that's where you have that advantage over a company developing its own software with its own data. If you've got access to the market, you're able to put hypotheses together on a much bigger data set to observe trends, that all-time view that we talked about. So you could provide a service which is differentiated on all of those aspects. But anyway, so I think that this is a debate, I think, that will continue to develop. And I would encourage anyone to have a look at the Microsoft chat way he's talked about it, because he's very transparent in the ways in which it may negatively affect some of their revenue streams, but sees the kind of wider play, and that they'll kind of grow into other areas, which is, I think, the right attitude for anybody in software development or software as a service.
One final point on this, and that is that I've made a career so far out of looking at what's going on at the kind of fringes of the wider tech space, and then knowing that there is usually about a 10 to 15 year lag that gets into maritime. And so when we make predictions about what's going to happen in maritime, they're built on what's already happening in the kind of wider world outside of maritime. That gap is getting smaller and smaller, I must say, year on year. So it's getting harder and harder to do. But what I will say is there's all these LinkedIn posts going on about the death of SaaS and all that sort of stuff. What I don't see happening anytime soon is that the shipping industry is going to suddenly stop buying SaaS or anything like that. I just think that that's too much of a leap. So I think this is we are talking about something that is a very long-term play rather than something that is going to happen overnight in shipping.
Yeah, I think I echo exactly what you said there. I've made a career out of doing exactly that, looking at trends and then knowing that I've got a good buffer before it hits maritime, to work out how and then sound very clever. And that is shrinking for sure. It's becoming much, much harder. But I think the other thing to say is that I think you're right. There are people saying it's not going to make any difference. SaaS is just going to carry on. It will just evolve with AI. And then there are people at the other end saying this is going to kill. There won't be any applications anymore. You'll just be talking into HAL, to use the Arthur C. Clarke reference, this computer that you chat to, and it just basically kind of does it all for you. The extremes are generally wrong, and there was plenty of chat around like the mobile phone is going to kill the PC, the laptop, is not going to be a thing anymore. We haven't seen that. It tends to be additive. And if you think about it, your laptop has evolved as a result of your phone, because it suddenly knows a hell of a lot of different information, which the phone is able to kind of augment and tell it. And your laptop then becomes more useful to you because of your phone and because of the way it extends into other things as well. But I think it's really naive to think this isn't going to change and challenge a lot of the things that we've come to know about the way software is developed and software as a service. And I think that the smart people will start to look at and understand that need for not to kind of do everything, because no one platform is ever going to be any good if it tries to do everything involved in the logistics of shipping, but to understand that the customer needs for all those things to work together, and that agentic AI can be a means to be able to make your part of the puzzle work much, much more effectively and deal with some of that need that the customer has for configurability and for exceptions and all those things we talk about.
Should we talk about something that isn't AI?
If we must.
I've got an interesting one that I saw this week that struck me. So last year, there was a fairly quiet Supreme Court ruling here in the UK. It's a case called Finch v Surrey County Council. And actually, it turns out it has quite wide implications potentially for the maritime industry in the UK, particularly for ports. So the Supreme Court, which is the top court in the UK, ruled that emissions from burning extracted fossil fuels, so that's downstream or scope 3 emissions, are legally considered effects of a construction project. So the reason this came about was that there's a Horse Hill oil site down on the south coast that had been approved for planning permission. In the approval, they didn't account for end use combustion emissions. And so I'll quote from the judge in the ruling. So, quote, "The whole purpose of extracting fossil fuels is to make hydrocarbons available for combustion. It can therefore be said with virtual certainty that once oil has been extracted from the ground, the carbon contained within it will sooner or later be released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and so will contribute to global warming." So the consequence of this happened last year, but it's now starting to spread. There's legal action spreading to other projects that are under development. And a whole host of campaigners are now arguing that all emissions tied to infrastructure must be accounted for. And that brings ports in the UK quite squarely into the picture. So ports, based on this ruling, depending on how you interpret it, will need to take into account the Scope 3 emissions from vessels visiting. And to date, I think only the PLA in London is the only port that has said we will include emissions from visiting vessels in our Scope 3 emissions when we report our emissions. In theory, now every port's going to have to do that, which means every port's going to have to understand the emissions from those visiting ships and then start to look at how to take mitigating measures for those visiting ships as well. And it has a big knock-on implication for any modelling for new port infrastructure in the UK, because you're going to have to take into account the emissions from the vessels that visit that port infrastructure, whatever it is. So actually, very quiet ruling that no one really thought much of last year, turns out could have massive implications for the UK port sector.
Yeah, and precedent is, as we know, in law, is one of the key things, and there's then precedent.
Yeah, there's no overturning that because it's all the way up at the top of the Supreme Court.
Wow. So, but a lot of people will be looking at that and saying, yeah, but Nick, that's quite clearly they're extracting fuel. The fuel is going to get burned. It's going to go up the stack, whatever, and they're going to see that relationship really clearly. How are you making that jump to that being de facto relating to, well, firstly, any new ports, I can see that a little bit more clearly, but existing ports, how do you see that connection?
Because it creates a requirement. Let me rephrase that. It massively expands the requirement on how you measure Scope 3 emissions. So this is an area that is fairly new. Everyone is sort of trying to get to grips with what Scope 3 emissions mean. A great example of this, actually, nothing to do with ports, but is in the crewing sector. Most shipping companies obviously produce Scope 1 emissions by driving ships around. That makes perfect sense. But a massive source of Scope 3 emissions is crew flights, getting crew on and off the ship.
Yeah.
Because obviously any flight that's booked is a huge source of emissions relative to what happens.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, at the moment, it doesn't really, it kind of goes into a too difficult pile. We don't need to worry about this, but I think that will change. This is kind of the equivalent thing in the port sector, is that to date, ports have had to think about Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions very, very carefully. And it's kind of been left to the discretion of the port about how they interpret their Scope 3 emissions, whether they include the visiting vessel or not. In theory, if the shipping company is looking after their Scope 1 emissions, then the port doesn't really need to include it in their Scope 3. And that's the kind of get out. What this ruling says is that any downstream effects of the project need to take that into account. So visiting ships to ports will have to be included in the port's Scope 3 emissions reporting, which, if you think about it, will be one of the biggest sources of emissions for a port, if not the biggest source.
Absolutely. I guess if we sort of we look at that in the wider context of what that would mean, it would mean potentially that ports over time may decide that it's not in their interest to permit certain vessels that are not managing their emissions within the boundaries that they've set for themselves, commercial boundaries.
The other potentially wider implication, which I think is possibly a little bit more of an unknown at this point, is what it could do to the wider energy sector in terms of actually moving oil around the world. If you own a tanker and that tanker can move 1 million barrels of oil in a voyage, you then have to take into account the fact that oil at some point is going to be burned, and therefore that then becomes the shipping company's Scope 3 emissions. This could turn into a massive, massive issue if it's not handled quite carefully.
So we will, I guess, see how other countries respond to the same kind of things, and whether they're influenced by the decision of what happens in the UK. But it speaks to that whole thing. I was saying the other day, wasn't I, about the sort of fuel EU and EU ETS, and the fact that and again, it speaks to, we go round and round in circles, don't we? But this sort of thing that operating in isolation is almost impossible now. There are so many different players and stakeholders who are having to report on what each other are doing, and each are influencing the profile of that they are then, in terms of the emissions that they're having to report on, and the credits that they're having to purchase and all that sort of stuff. And we also,
Yeah.
in it being a globalized world, it's very, very difficult, to sort of ignore. But if it were to move to the kind of thing that you're talking about there, where the tanker is going to need to predict what's going to happen to the cargo, and account for the fact that they have profited by that. I mean, that's essentially the discussion, right? They're like, their job is they're getting paid to take it somewhere where it's going to be used. And if they're then asked to kind of, well, then you've got to pay your charge for the money that you're making from that process and the problem you're causing somewhere else.
Down the
I mean,
line.
it's mind-boggling to try and figure that out, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's why for the most part, shipping does end up in this kind of too difficult pile for lots of things. But I think any publicly traded shipping companies over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the way that sustainability reporting is going for publicly traded organizations, I think that's going to come under a significantly more scrutiny over the next 3, 5 years.
And what it also means is that sort of simulation component that we often talk about is the ability to be able to predict. So what vessels am I likely to have in port? What are their likely emissions? To be able to record, you to plan ahead, to be able to kind of look at your budgets and everything, you would need to be able to make those kind of predictions. And that's where data and technology is going to become even more important within that port infrastructure, to be able to kind of predict that, to manage that. And then on the emissions side, what's the rules of the country that you're then trading with and that are on your voyage plan? And it's phenomenally complex, and only kind of technology can make that remotely manageable, I think.
Yeah.
But very interesting. Also on that, since we're talking about emissions, and the other thing that caught my eye, a bit of a shout out, I think, just another splash again. Shipping's first centrifugal carbon capture system installed on a Scorpio tanker. I always like a first. And this is apparently the first of its kind to be there. Now, I think you've done a bit of research into carbon capture, haven't you?
We have, yeah. A few interesting things about carbon capture. The primary one, well, okay, it's primary two. One is, what do you do with the carbon once it's been captured on board? And we've been involved with various feasibility studies over the years, particularly in the container sector, where unfortunately the answer is it's just not feasible. It takes so much space on board that would ordinarily be given to cargo that it makes the whole voyage uneconomical when you take that cargo out, to put carbon tanks in effectively. And the second question is, what do you do with the CO2 that's been captured? Is there a kind of reverse supply chain where someone's going to take that CO2 and potentially do something valuable with it, or worse ways, sequester it into the ground so that it stays out of the atmosphere? There's a couple of interesting ones that we've seen where, for example, instead of the system generating CO2, it generates pure carbon. So it generates like a sort of graphite type substance. And that is a genuinely useful substance. So then it can just be taken ashore, pumped ashore, and go off to be used in various industrial processes. But it's a challenging thing to get right. And it's really encouraging to see that this has happened. And there's actually something on a ship.
Yeah, this is the Carbon Ridge is the one. And in the photograph, it looks actually pretty much the sort of dimensions of a container on there. But I think that the trick here is it's actually processing it on board, I think, to try and deal with that issue that you were talking about there in terms of storage and making it manageable. So well done to them. I mean, I think when I first heard about carbon capture as a potential solution, it kind of made me really uneasy, because I sort of, you talk about what are the problems with our world, and it's the kind of the generation of this kind of waste is a major issue. So kind of generating more waste than we need to kind of pipe underground and everything. It doesn't sit easily into that. It's sort of like we're just kind of repeating the same thing, and then in some point in the future we'll have a problem with all the carbon we've stored and stuff like that. So I love the idea of it being processed into something useful, but I also think that when you look at where we are at the moment, I think anything that can buy us a little bit more time is helpful, because we are struggling to deal with and to meet the targets that we're doing. And I don't say that because I think we should reduce our ambitions in any way, but I do think that, that it's clearly there is a lot that needs to be done, the logistics, the manufacturing up, the scaling up and all that sort of stuff. So I think if it's part of a plan that gets us to buy us some time while we get the rest of it in place, and it's not something that's just seen as a sticking plaster, which will ultimately not get us anywhere. But
there's quite an interesting proof of concept going on at the moment, which I think is still under testing, but a UK company called Seabound has installed a carbon capture storage system onto a ship that is chartered by Heidelberg Materials. So the discharge point for the captured CO2, it ends up on board getting converted into limestone, which then goes to Heidelberg Materials concrete factory. And that then becomes one of the key ingredients in the concrete, which creates obviously carbon capture for the ship, but then also closer to carbon neutral concrete as well. And concrete's a massive, massive carbon emitter, carbon problem. So it's a really nice kind of circular economy use case there. And I don't know exactly where they're at with the testing, but I think they're just getting to the point where they're starting to install kit on board the ships. But that's a really exciting project as well.
That I love. I mean, I think that's really kind of that virtuous sort of cycle there. And again, being able to kind of track all of that, it does speak again to this need to kind of get that connectivity across the whole of the supply chain and to really think about how we're interfacing between these different systems, because that would then affect Heidelberg's, performance. And so you get this kind of, that reliance of between sort of partners, actors in the supply chain, some really interesting partnerships that might develop around that. So I think that's a really nice story. I like that very much. Time for just one other thing as well. As you know, if not, for self-gratification, if nothing else, I like to hark back to previous episodes and to sort of paint a picture. Like, I can't remember which episode. We've done so many now. This is number 8.
It was one of the early ones.
It was.
We talked about CFARER, weren't we?
We talked about CFARER. I'm not sure if it was this. Yeah, I think it was the same week. But anyway, we talked about CFARER before, and we talked more broadly around the fact that lots of people, lots of entrants, lots of software vendors coming into the space, funding coming into the space, and how little of that money around the software was really geared towards the kind of safety aspects of it. Most of the money coming in is about sort of improving the performance of the vessel, the voyage, the lowering of the use of fuels and stuff. And we were a little bit, I think I was perhaps a little bit cynical about, or worried that that was perhaps not something that was being prioritized. So it's really good to see a couple of stories this week in your new publication. They're kind of not related. I mean, they're both related in the sense that they're both innovative tech solutions to this safety space. The first one links into the CFARER story, and this was Kaiko, who we know those guys, very, very nice company, who are working in the sort of in inspection performance space. So we're really looking at how you can kind of do a better auditing and prepare for inspections. And they're reporting some ROI gains, which is really interesting to see because it's a difficult thing to measure. I think I noted it down. 34%. Does that rings a bell with me? Is that?
Yeah, they've managed to cut. So TMS Cardiff Gas own a fleet of, I think it's like 15, 16 LNG carriers that are obviously part of the CFARER regime. And for anyone who doesn't know, CFARER is the ship inspection and reporting. I can't remember what the E is. It's a bad week for abbreviations, but it's a voluntary reporting scheme for tankers. And I say it's voluntary because it's not legally required. But if you want to be chartered by an oil major, you need to be part of the CFARER scheme. It's run by Ofcom. And we talked about the new CFARER 2.0, which is a kind of digital first approach to running these inspections. By bringing in the Keiko Systems product, TMS Cardiff Gas have managed to cut CFARER observations, and an observation is like something that's not quite right. They managed to cut CFARER observations by 34%, which is a big old drop.
Yeah, it is. And I think that the interesting thing around that is it's a sort of adjacent area to training. And there's also in this space NavGuide solutions as well, which some guys that I know they're sort of looking at it a bit more of a kind of like how to prepare the team for it in terms of showing them, before what they should be looking at as they're doing their inspection round. So a little bit more kind of on the support side, but it's this area where you're basically sort of saying how to learn almost in advance, I think, from the inspection that you're going to have by conducting your own sort of pre-inspection or audit, whatever. And you're able to run through the guidance, whether that's, the sort of video guidance that NavGuide do or the kind of published guidance that's in Kaiko, as well as kind of doing clever things around being able to collect evidence, to look at that against other things as well. And guess what? Getting people used to and familiar and understanding what inspectors are looking to see these are not methods to cheat inspections. These are methods to understand what those inspectors are really looking for, and to preempt that by being able to look yourself and prove and the things that are there. So a 34% drop is really significant, and be interesting to kind of understand a little bit more about the data behind that. But if they've achieved that, then that's great. And I think it's always good to see, not always easy, but really good to see ROI measurements, return on investment from software like that.
Yeah.
The second one is a bit different, but it's the use of again, we're going to get back into AI, aren't we? For man overboard situations, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is quite an interesting company called Zalim. They're based in the UK, and actually the founder of Zalim went to Fleetwood Nautical College, same college I went to, which obviously just shows that Fleetwood is the most forward-thinking, technologically advanced college in the UK. He founded Zalim a few years back, and with the aim of creating a kind of offshore support, man overboard, autonomous vessel that can help rescue someone who goes overboard. And that's part of a big long-term ambition, and they're still working towards that. But they've recently released some new software that they call Zoe.
Zoe, yes.
And it's an intelligent person in the water and object detection system, which can alert both search and rescue teams who are in the sky, and then also kind of surface search and rescue teams to people in the water. And the idea is that it'll be more reliable than having a kind of human lookout doing it.
Yeah, and just for those that didn't go to sea or whatever, if you ever see footage from a search and rescue helicopter, for example, trying to find somebody that's fallen from a vessel, number one, in the kind of tides that you get in deep water, the currents and so on, and the speed of a vessel, it's not something you can put the brakes on.
It's nearly impossible.
The speed with which that person has moved through away from you is very, very quick. And then second, trying to see a person in the waves, is almost impossible. So if this is an area where software and technology can play a role, then that's fantastic. The thing that I wasn't sure reading the articles, I have seen a couple of sort of drone applications and stuff for this. Do you know how the software actually works in this case?
As far as I know, it is a camera-based system. That the bit they haven't done is the cameras, so they're just focusing on the software, and it's effectively classification software. So it's like a type of AI that is able to recognize objects consistently. So if you give it lots of training data, you give it lots of pictures of cats, over time it'll be able to say this is a cat. What they've done is, since 2020, 5 years of data collection, they've given it loads and loads of data, and they've basically taught it to say this is a person in the water, this is a person overboard. And so they've done some testing on board the Ambition cruise ship, and they managed to get a 96.8% man overboard detection at 300 meters range, which is pretty good, and is certainly, anyone who's been involved in man overboard drills will know, if you don't maintain sight on the person for the entire duration, once you lose them, it's so difficult to get them back. And so if a system like this, beyond the point where the man overboard has actually been alerted, if a system like this can help with the tracking, it should massively increase the chances of getting the person back, which is really exciting. It's really cool to see these application of this sort of stuff going into safety tech.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because we did say earlier, we felt that it was a bit underrepresented, the safety aspect, and this is great. And obviously massive implications, or application, I should say, huge application in cruise, where you've got huge numbers of passengers, and sadly, occasionally people do go overboard. So, brilliant. So, I mean, I think that's probably all we've got time for this week. It's been
definitely. And you're on holiday next week, aren't you?
I'm on holiday next week, so please no tears when no episode lands. But yeah, so there'll be no undocked next week, but then normal service will resume, and we'll be getting to episode 9, so quite close to the 12 where you were going to make the decision whether to carry on or not, right?
We are indeed, and I just don't know that we've got enough people subscribed to justify, So if you're not subscribed and you want to keep listening to these, go and subscribe. Do it while Raal's on holiday, and that will make his holiday much better.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just dial in and get a nice little dopamine boost. So yeah, so no episode next week, but we'll come back, and hopefully in that week we'll have a number of other new scoops and stories to share with you in what will be episode 9.
Fingers crossed. Thanks, Raal. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Speak to you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.